Okay, so let's continue understanding the exception handling concept. Okay, so what we understood in the last session, let's have a quick revision, then we'll move on. Okay, so what we understood, what do you mean by exception and what do you mean by exception handling? Okay, so what do you mean by exception? Exception is nothing but some issue. Okay, so while performing some execution at the runtime, if you are facing some exception or some issue due to which your program will get terminated abnormally, that is nothing but exception. And what do you mean by exception handling? Exception handling is nothing but if you are facing any exception at the runtime, how you are going to handle that exception is nothing but exception handling. Okay, so in Java, how you are going to handle the exception? By writing the try and catch block. Always you need to write the risky code inside the try block. Okay, what do you mean by risky code? Risky code means the piece of code due to which you are facing the exception, that is nothing but risky code. Okay, what do you mean by handling code? If any exception will occur, how you are going to handle that exception, that piece of logic you need to write inside the catch block. Okay, so that is how we are going to handle the exception. Okay, how many types of exceptions we are having? It is nothing but checked exception and unchecked exception. How you are going to identify a respective class is a checked exception type or unchecked exception type? If you will see, if that exception class is a child class of exception class, so that means it is a checked exception class, checked exception type class. Okay, if the respective class is extending the runtime exception, so then you can identify, okay, so it is a unchecked exception class. Okay, so but what do you mean by checked exception? Checked exception is nothing but the exception which will be checked by the compiler, so that is nothing but checked exception. And the exception which will not checked by the compiler, that is nothing but unchecked exception. Okay, so that does not mean कि checked exception will come at the compile time. No, always remember exception will occur at the runtime only. Whether it is a checked exception or unchecked exception, every exception will occur at the runtime. At the runtime, you should not face any exception that will be checked by the compiler. So that means compiler will force you to handle the exception. Okay, so that is nothing but checked exception. If compiler will force you to handle the exception means it will force you to write the try and catch block. Okay, until and unless you have not written the try and catch block, then compiler will not let you to compile the code. Okay, so that is nothing but checked exception. What do you mean by unchecked exception? Whether you are writing try catch block or whether you are handling the exception or not, that will not checked by the compiler. Okay, anyhow that exception it will get occur. Whether you are handling or not handling also, compiler will not involved in this case. That is nothing but unchecked exception. Okay, so now let's try to understand some more concept on top of this exception handling. Okay, see, let's take the same example to understand further. Okay, here let's say I have taken one class called class test, public static void main method. Okay, so what I am writing here, let's say system.out.println of 10 by 2, system.out.println of 20 by 2, system.out.println of 30 by 0, system.out.println of 40 by 2, system.out.println of 50 by 2. Okay, let's say this is the piece of code I have written here. Okay, now once I have written this piece of code, what I will do, I will try to execute my program. Let's say, okay, whenever I will try to execute my program, who will come into the picture? JVM. So now JVM it will comes to which method? Main method, and it will try to execute your program line by line. Okay, for the first line it will give me the output as 5. Okay, for the second line it will give me the output as 10. Okay, but now whenever it is trying to execute this third line, something divided by 0 is not possible in Java. So that is why at this point only it will throw some exception. Which exception it will throw? It is nothing but arithmetic exception. Okay, always remember, whenever any exception will occur, internally JVM will immediately it will create one exception class object with respect to that exception. What I mean, at this point of time, which exception it occur? Arithmetic exception itself or not? Okay, so immediately what JVM it will do? Immediately at this point of time, okay, which exception it occurred? Arithmetic exception. With respect to this arithmetic exception, internally JVM immediately it will create one object like arithmetic exception is equal to new arithmetic exception. Okay, whenever any exception will occur, with respect to that exception class, object will get created by the JVM. Okay, now as this is causing the exception, so that means it is a risky code itself or not. Okay, how I am going to handle this exception? So I need to surround this risky piece of code inside the try block. Okay, and which exception got occurred? Arithmetic exception. So with respect to that arithmetic exception, I need to write one catch block. Okay, some handling code I can write here, or something like I'm printing here exception occurred. Something I'm just trying to print it. Okay, now whenever JVM is trying to execute, what will happen? It will execute this first line 5, then 10. Now at this time what will happen? Whenever it is trying to calculate something divided by 0, at this point itself what will happen? One arithmetic exception occurred itself or not? What do you mean by arithmetic exception occurred? Immediately JVM will create, if any exception will occur, with respect to that exception class, JVM immediately it will create one exception object. Okay, and it will check with respect to this exception object, is there any catch block is there or not? Okay, so this is which class object? Arithmetic exception class object. With respect to this arithmetic exception, programmer has written any catch block or not? So that means program I have already written here catch block with respect to this arithmetic exception itself or not? So this object it will be stored into this variable e. Okay, so that means this e is nothing but it's a variable which will hold this exception object. Okay, now as I have written I am handling this arithmetic exception, so then the respective catch block will be called, or this respective catch block will be executed, and it will print exception occurred. Okay, as I have handled this exception, then the rest of the piece of code it will get executed. So you will get the output as 5, 10, exception occurred. Then here you will get as output as 20 and 25. Okay, so what I mean is whenever you are facing some exception, immediately JVM is going to create one exception object with respect to this exception class type. Okay, if let's say some null pointer exception occurred, okay, so immediately what JVM it will do? It will create one null pointer exception class object, and it will check for is there any catch block is there or not with respect to the null pointer exception. Okay, what I mean is, let's I have written here class test public static void main method. Here let's I have defined one method called public void m1, which is taking the parameter as string type, something let's say string name. Okay, here what is the logic I am writing? For example, I am trying to find out the length of this name. Okay, so that means what I can write here, system.out.println of name.length method I will call itself or not. Okay, now how can I call this m1 method? Test t is equals to new test t dot m1 method. While calling this m1 method, I need to pass some parameter, string parameter. Okay, let's say I am passing here some value. My name let's say I am passing. Okay, Prasanna. Okay, again I am trying to call this m1 method. How can I call this t.m1 method? T.m1 method. Okay, now again I am trying to call this m1 method. How I am calling this m1 method? T.m1 of. Now this time instead of passing a value, what I am passing here? Some null value. Okay, Now whenever I'm trying, so now if I'm trying to execute, okay, who will come into the picture? JVM. Now JVM it will comes to this main method. I'm trying to create this test class object and I'm calling this m1 method. While calling this m1 method, I am passing some string value. Okay, so now it will comes to this m1 method. On top of this name, it will call the length method and it will try to find me the size of that string value. Okay, so what is nothing but it will give me the output as 8. Okay, for this it will be 8 and for this it will be 6. Okay, now while executing this line of code, what I am doing here, I am calling t.m1 method by passing the null value. While I am passing this null value, this value it will come, it will be stored into this name. Now what is this variable it is holding? Which value? Null value. Always remember, null dot sum method is equals to null pointer exception, always you will get. Okay, on top of this null value, if you will call any method, you will get the null pointer exception. So that means with this name is having which value now? Null. So on top of this null value, you are calling this length method itself or not? So immediately what will happen? You will get the null pointer exception. Okay, so now what I told earlier, if any exception will occur, JVM immediately it will create one exception object with respect to that exception class type. Okay, so that means which exception object will get occur now? Which exception object will get created now? Null pointer exception class object it will get created. Okay, now JVM will check, is there any, with respect to this null pointer exception type, is there any catch block as a programmer I have written or not? Okay, let's say I have written here, try catch of which exception? Null pointer exception E. So then this catch block piece of code will be executed and this object it will be stored into this E variable. Okay, so the thing is, what I was trying to explain is nothing but whenever any exception will occur, with respect to that exception class, there will be one object will get created by the JVM itself. Okay, so that is not that is how exception it is happening. Okay, so whenever some exception, it is not only null pointer exception or arithmetic exception, whatever exception will occur. Let's say file not found exception object got occur, file not found exception occurred. With respect to that file not found exception, again there will be a file not found exception object will be created and it will look for a respective catch block. If there is a catch block with respect to that file not found exception it is there, so then the respective catch block piece of code it will get executed.
Okay, so what we have discussed now, so let's say, let me take a class here, class test. Let me have the main method. Okay, now let me take one method, public void m1 method, and which is taking some parameter, let's say string name. Okay, I want to, what is my requirement here? I want to find the length of this name, right? So what I need to do here, so system.out.println of so system.out.println of name dot length method, right, in order to get the length of this name. Okay, so then how to call this m1 method? Let me create the test class object, test t is equals to new test. Okay, t dot m1 method. Let me first of all pass some value, Prasanna. Okay, now I'm passing t dot m1 method. Let me pass the value as now Mishra. Then let me pass some value as, instead of some value, let me pass some value as null, right? Okay, let me add one more value here, t.m1 of, let's say Kumar. Okay, now let's say I have written this program. Okay, after writing this program, I want to execute it. Okay, so if we'll execute, what will happen? I will get the length for this value. I'll get the length for this value, and when I'm passing this null value, okay, so what will happen? This name variable, it will hold this null value, and on top of this null value, I am calling some method, or I'm trying to execute some method. Okay, always remember null dot some method equals to, you will get the null pointer exception. You cannot call a method on top of this null value, right? So you will get the null pointer exception over here. So let me execute this program first. See, if you'll see here, what will be the output I'll get here? For this first two value, you will get the output 8 and 6. Then whenever it will execute this line number 7, I'm passing this null value, I am getting this null pointer exception. Okay, so then this remaining piece of code, it won't get execute, right? So at this point itself, you are getting this null pointer exception, right?
Now let's try to understand some more concept on top of this. Suppose let me take some scenario. Here I have written here class test. Now, so what is my requirement? My requirement is I want to read the contents from this file. Okay. Now here I am having one main method, public static void main method. Okay, I am having another method called public void m1 method. I am having another method public void m2 method. Okay, for example, I am having main method, m1 method and m2 method. Okay, now what is my requirement? I want to perform this file reading operation in this m2 method. Okay, so then how I am going to write this piece of code? Okay, how we can write this piece of code to perform the read operation from a file? Okay, so that is why we will create one class object is nothing but buffered reader. Br is equals to new buffered reader of new file reader of new file of the location of this file. Okay, so this is how we will create one buffered reader object itself or none. Okay, now what I need to do, we need to read the contents. How? System.out.println of br.readLine method. Okay, now what I want to do, my requirement is I want to execute this m2 method. How can I execute this m2 method? Let me call this m1 method from this main method. Okay, suppose let's say I am calling this m1 method. How can I call this m1 method? By creating the object test. T is equals to new test. T dot m1 method. Okay, now from this m1 method I want to call this m2 method. How can I call this m2 method? As this is one instance method, this is also one instance method, I can able to call it directly itself or not. Let's say I am calling it m2 method directly. Okay, so that means I have written this piece of code. Okay, now once I have written this piece of code, what I need to do? I need to compile my code or not. So now if I try to compile, okay, so as I am performing the file operation, I need to import one package called import java.io.star. So now let's say once I have written this program, what I need to do? I need to compile my code. Okay, so while compiling the code, what will happen? Will my code will get compiled over here? No, right? Why? Because I am trying to perform this file operation. Okay, so what compiler will think, okay, so programmer is trying to perform some file operation. Programmer is trying to reading the contents from a file. Okay, but what if the respective file is not present in the file specific file location? Okay, in the C drive Prasanna folder, if let's say this file it is not there, so that means there might be a chance of getting the file not found exception itself or not. So that is why compiler will force me to handle the exception. Okay, so that is why compiler will not let me compile the code. Okay, so that is why what I need to do, I need to handle the code by writing this try and catch block. Catch of which exception? IO exception. Why I am writing the IO exception? Because both file not found exception and IO exception can be handled in this IO exception catch block, because IO exception is a parent class of this file not found exception. Okay, what I told you earlier, if any exception will occur, with respect to that exception, one exception class object will get created or not. If the file is not found at the in this particular location, so then it will create one file not found exception object. So that object can be held in this e variable itself or not. Why? Because child class object can be held by this parent class reference variable. So that is why instead of due to the space issue, instead of writing two catch block with respect to file not found exception and IO exception, I am just writing only one exception, which is nothing but IO exception. Okay, but it is always recommended to write the catch block with respect to that exception. We supposed to write here two catch block. One is with respect to file not found exception, one is with respect to IO exception. Okay, as due to the space issue, and I'm just writing in one catch block. Okay, now let's concentrate. Now I have handled the exception by using this try and catch block. Okay, so now once I have written this program, now I will try to compile my code. Okay, Java C test.java. Okay, some handling logic I am writing here. Let's say system.out.println of something I am just printing Mr. Okay, now once I have written this program, what I will do, I need to compile my code. Okay, how can I compile my code? Java C test.java. So when I will compile, a dot class file will get created, then I will try to execute. Okay, once I am trying to execute here, now if I am trying to execute, while before executing, let's say I deleted this file. Okay, so then what will happen? There will be a file not found exception will occur, then this respective catch block it will get created, it will be executed, and it will print me Mr. itself or not. If let's say the file it is there, then this catch block will not execute, it will be able to successfully read this abc.txt content file, whatever it is there, my name, Prasanna, it will be printed. Okay, now let's try to understand on top of this. Up to this it is clear, right? So whenever I am trying to perform the file operation. Okay, and while performing the file operation, as it might throw the file not found exception or IO exception, which is nothing but checked exception, here compiler is forcing me to handle the exception by writing the try and catch block. Okay, now as a programmer, let's say what I did, I am telling, hey, I am not interested to handle any exception. I am not interested to write this try and catch block. Okay, so what I mean is, once I have written this program, now if I'll go for the compilation, with this piece of code, compiler will give me the error, its compilation error itself or not. Okay, what it will tell, hey, as you are performing the file operation, there might be, you are getting the either file not found exception or IO exception. Where is your handling code? Okay, now I will, as a programmer, I am telling like, hey, I am not interested to handle this exception. Okay, I am not going to write this try and catch block. Okay, but compiler is telling you have to write the try and catch block so then only I will let you to compile the code. But as a programmer, I am telling like I am not interested to handle this exception. Then what compiler will do? Compiler will give me the second option. Okay, compiler will give me the another option saying like, okay, so if you are not interested to handle the exception by writing the try and catch block, then do one thing. Whatever the exception object it got occurred, as you are not handling that exception, or as you are not interested to handle that exception, then throws that exception object. Throws which exception? IO exception. Okay, what compiler will do? Compiler will give me the another option or second option saying like, okay, if you are not interested to handle the exception, then throws that exception to your caller method who is calling you. Let them handle the exception. Okay, if in this M2 method, as you are performing the file operation, you have to handle the exception. But let's say you are not handling the exception, you are not interested to handle the exception, then throws that exception object to your caller method. Let your caller method handle the exception itself. Okay, now once I have written the program, okay, what I told to compiler, hey compiler, I am not interested to handle the exception. Okay, so that is why I am not writing the try and catch block. So that is why compiler will give me the another option saying, okay, so if you are not handling the exception, then throws that exception to your caller method. Who is the caller method? M1, because inside this M1 method only I am calling this M2 method only or not. So that means let your caller method handle the exception. So that is why now who will become the risky code? This M2 method is M2 method is nothing but your risky code only or not. Why? Because if you are not calling this M2 method, so then is there any chance of getting the exception? No, right? As you are calling this M2 method inside this M1 method, so that and inside this M2 method you are performing the file operation, it might throw some exception which is nothing but file not found exception. So that is why now who is the risky code? M2 method is the risky code. So that is why compiler will force this here itself to this M1 method. Hey, you have to write the handling code. Okay, so now what compiler will tell to this M1? Okay, as you are calling this M2 method and this M2 method is performing the file operation and he is not interested to handle the exception and he is throwing that exception to you. Now it is your responsible to handle the exception. So that is why we need to surround this M2 method in the try and catch block. Which catch block? IO exception. And the respective handling code you need to write inside this catch block itself. Up to this clear? Okay. What do you mean by throws keyword? By using this throws keyword, you can delegate your exception object to the caller method itself. Okay. Now this now compiler will comes to which method? M1 method. It will ask like, hey M1 method, as you are calling this M2 method internally, now M2 method is throwing some exception. Now where is your handling code? Okay, so that is why compiler will force here to handle or to write the try and catch block. But now what I am telling, I am not interested to handle the exception over here. Okay, let's say I am telling to the compiler, hey, I am also not interested to handle the exception. Okay, so then what compiler will tell me? Compiler will tell like, okay, so if you are also not interested to handle the exception, then do one thing, take the second option by saying like, if you are not interested to handle the exception, let throws that exception again to your caller method. Throws which exception? IO exception. Now this exception object will get again delegated to whom? To its caller method. Now who is the caller method here? In the main method, you are trying to call this M1 method itself or not? So that means who is the risky code now? This piece of line is nothing but your risky code. as you are calling to this m1 method, internally this m1 method is calling to this m2 method, and in this m2 method you are performing the file operation. Okay, and none of the method is trying to handle the exception by using the try and catch block. So that is why compiler will give me the compilation error at this point, again saying like, hey, none of the methods are trying to handle the exception by writing the try and catch block. Now it is your responsible to handle the exception. So that is why you have to write the try and catch block over here itself. Okay, so the respective, which exception again you need to write here? IO exception only. Okay, and the respective handling logic you need to write here. Okay, now what I am doing here, again I am telling like, no, I am not interested to handle the exception here again. Okay, let's say I am telling to compiler, hey, I am not going to handle the exception, or I am not going to write the try and catch block over here. Okay, so then what compiler will do again? Okay, so if you are also not interested to handle the exception by writing the try and catch block, so then let your caller also handle this exception. Okay, so then you need to throw which exception? IO exception. Okay, now if you throw this IO exception, who is calling to this main method is nothing but JVM. Now this exception object will be delegated to whom? To the JVM. Okay, inside this JVM, who is there? Inside the JVM there is a component is there which is nothing but default exception handler. What this default exception handler it will do? Okay, if none of the methods are trying to handle the exception by writing try and catch block, and each and every method are delegating that exception to its caller method, and he is also delegating that exception to its caller method, again he is delegating that exception to its caller. So at the end, who will receive that exception object? JVM. Okay, now JVM will hand over that exception object to whom? To the default exception handler. What this default exception handler it will do? It will try to print the exception name. Okay, what is the exception name? It will give you the exception name as, okay, at this point there is a file not found exception occurred. File not found exception. Okay, so it will print the exception type and the respective exception message. What is the exception message it will get? At this particular location, the respective file is not found in the system itself. Okay, so that exception message it will print, and the start trace of this exception it will show. What do you mean by start trace? In which from which method to which method the exception got delegated. Okay, so first of all, the exception got at m2 method, the exception occurred at m1 method, the exception occurred at main method. That start trace of this exception it will display in the console itself. It will print the, who will print the start trace of this exception? Default exception handler only. Okay, so what do you mean by throws keyword then? If as a programmer, if I am not writing the respective try and catch block, then by using this throws keyword we can delegate that exception object to the respective color method. Okay, so that is nothing but throws keyword. Okay, and this is with respect to checked exception only, because for this checked exception compiler will force you to handle the exception by writing the try and catch block. Okay, for runtime exception or for unchecked exception, compiler will not involve here. Okay, compiler will not force you to write the try catch or declare throws keyword or not. Okay, this throws keyword we are going to use in case of checked exception only. You can use in case of unchecked exception, but that is no use. Okay,
So what we have discussed, so let me take a class here. So class test, let me take a main method. Okay, now let me have two other method. Let's say I'm defining here public void m1 method and public void m2 method. Okay, now I want to call this m1 method. How can I call this m1 method? So test t is equals to new test t dot m1 method. Okay, now inside this m1 method, let's say I'm trying to call this m2 method. Okay, so I'm trying to call this m2 method. What I want to do inside this m2 method, I want to perform some file operation. Let's say I want to read some content from this file. Okay, so first of all, let me create a file over here. Okay, right click, new file. Okay, let me give the file name as something profile. Okay, here I'm writing my name. So first of all, what is the requirement we are having? I want to read this content from this profile file, right? So then what is the logic that I need to write here? Okay, so first of all, we need to create which class object? Buffered reader br is equals to new buffered reader of new file reader of new file. Okay, so here we need to put the location of this file. Okay, so let me get the location first for this profile. So right click, copy, I'm taking the absolute path. Now I'm providing the file path location over here. Okay, now once we have created this buffered reader object, now how can we perform the read operation? So system.out.println of br.readline, right? Now if you'll see here, we are getting the compilation error over here itself or none in this case of file reader and readline. Why we are getting this compilation error? Because we are trying to access some file from this location, right? So what compiler will think, maybe at the time of execution JVM may not able to get this file in this file path location. Okay, so then at that time it may throw some file not found exception, or here you will see you will get the IO exception, right? So both this file not found exception and IO exceptions are nothing but checked exception. So that is why compiler is forcing us to handle the exception. So what we need to do, we need to write the corresponding try and catch block. Okay, try, and we need to put this risky code where inside this try block. Okay, and we need to write the catch block with respect to file not found exception e. Okay, system.out.println of something, let's say e dot get message, some handling logic I'm just writing. Okay, similarly for this read line also we need to write another catch block itself or not with respect to IO exception. Here also I'm trying to print it, system.out.println of e dot get message. Now we are ready with our program. Now let me try to execute. So I'm able to read the contents from this file itself or not. Okay, whatever the value it is there in this profile text file, so I'm able to read the contents from this file, right? But what if let's say I will delete this file? Okay, so if I'll delete this file, so then what will happen? Now JVM will not be able to find this file in this particular location itself or not. So then what will happen? It will throw me the exception. So now which exception it will throw? File not found exception it will throw. Okay, so that file not found exception, what I told, whenever any exception will occur, immediately one exception object will be created with respect to that class type, right? So that means here, as JVM will not be able to find the file at this particular location as I have deleted, so then immediately it will create one file not found exception object, who? JVM. Okay, once it will create that file not found exception object, it will be passed to this e object, and on top of this e object, file not found exception object, you are calling this get message method. So it will print the message with respect to the file not found exception. So if I'll execute now, so it will give me the exception message saying no such file or directory. Okay, so it is not able to find at that particular file location itself. Okay, So now, so that is why we are getting this exception. Okay, this is how we are going to write and we are going to handle the exception. So how we are going to handle the exception? By using the try and catch block. If this file not found exception, it will come. So then the respective catch block, it will get execute, right? But what is the next concept that we have understood is nothing but throws keyword. So what do you mean by throws keyword? For example, let's say here itself in the m2, inside this m2, I'm telling like, hey, I don't want to write this try catch block. Okay, so I'm telling like, hey, I don't want to write this try catch block, or I don't want to handle the exception inside this m2 method. Okay, so that means what then compile, so that means if you'll see here, we are getting the compilation error here itself or none. In case of this file reader and in case of this read line, we are getting the compilation error itself or none. What is the compilation error? If I will try to execute, it will give me the compilation error saying we are not handling the exception. Which exception? Both file not found exception and IO exception also. Okay, so it is telling like unreported exception, file not found exception must be caught or declared to be thrown. Okay, now see, as it is giving the compilation error, so that means compiler is forcing us to handle the exception. If let's say you are telling like, no, I don't want to handle the exception by writing the try and catch block, so then compiler will give you the second option. Okay, compiler will tell like, okay, so if you are not interested to handle the exception, so then do one thing, let's throws this exception object, whatever the exception object that you are getting, throws that exception object to whom? To your caller method itself. Now you see, now you won't get any compilation error. Now that compilation error, whatever it was giving here, it will not show here, because you are, whatever the exception object that got created, so now you are not handling that, you are not catching that exception object. Instead of catching that exception object, you are throwing that exception object to whom? To this caller method. So now who is the caller method here? In this m1 method, now while calling this m2 method, you are getting the compilation error by saying like add exception to the method signature. Okay, so here itself, now this piece of line, it is nothing but your risky code. Okay, so compiler is forcing here to handle the try and catch block. So then you can write here try and you can put this risky code to inside this try block. Okay, and you can write the respective catch block. Okay, I can write here catch of IO exception, let's say system.out.println of e.get message. Okay, now see, you will not get any compilation error now because you handle this exception. Okay, so this is nothing but throws keyword. So if you are not interested to write the try and catch block in this m2 method, then you can delegate this IO exception object or the respective exception object to the caller method by using this throws keyword. Okay, now let me execute now. Now see, you are getting the, your code is getting compiled and executed, and you got this exception and it is telling like no such file or directory. Okay, now let's say again, if you are telling like, no, I also don't want to, this m1 method also it will tell, let's say I also don't want to handle this exception, right? So now if you are not handling this exception in this m1 method, it is throwing that exception and you are only the calling the m2 method, so you will get the compilation error here. Okay, now instead of, let's say you are telling like, no, I am not interested to handle the exception, so then compiler will give you the second chance again. Okay, so if you are not handling the exception, then do one thing, then throws again which exception? Same IO exception to your caller method again. Now who is calling this m1 method? Nothing but main method. Inside this main method, you are calling this m1 method over here. So that means compiler will force here, or compiler only it will ask here, hey, as you are calling this m1 method, then you need to handle this exception from here. Okay, so then you need to write the try and catch block here. Now you need to write the corresponding catch block with respect to IO exception. Let's say e.get message. right? Now you will not get any compilation error. Anyhow, you have to handle that exception by writing the try and catch block. You have to write, as you are performing the file operation in this m2 method, you have to write, you have to handle this exception here only. But let's say you are not handling that exception here by writing the try and catch block, so then you can delegate that exception object to its color method. Who is the color method? This m1 method is nothing but color method. In this color method, in which line you are calling? In this line itself you are calling itself or not? So you have to write this try catch block again here. But again, if you are telling like, no, I don't want to handle this exception here by writing the try and catch block, then again compiler will ask you, okay, so if you are also not interested to handle the exception, then again you can also delegate that exception object to your caller method again. So that means who is the calling method now? Here itself I am calling itself or not. So that means this is now the risky code, because you are calling this m1 method. Internally this m1 method it is calling m2 method, and internally this m2 method it is performing the file operation, and none of the methods are trying to handle the exception. So that is why as you are calling this method, so that means you are the risky code. So that is why I need to surround this risky code inside this try and catch block. Okay, now let me execute it again. Let me put here system.out.println up, system.out.println, because I want to print that message, exception message. Okay. Now let me run it again. Now you will see I'm getting this exception message itself. Okay, so that means you have to handle the exception here itself. But again, let's say you are telling like, no, I also don't want to handle this exception here itself also. Again, let's say the main method, inside this main method you are telling like, no, I also don't want to handle the exception. So that means none of the methods are interested to handle this exception itself or none. No one is interested to handle this exception. Everyone is delegating the exception to its color method. Then here itself again compiler will give the option to this main method also. Hey, if you are also not interested to handle the exception, then you can also throw this IO exception. So then it will goes to its color method. Who is calling this main method? Nothing but JVM. So JVM is calling this main method itself or not? So again this IO exception object, it will get delegated to the JVM. Okay, so inside this JVM, what will happen? There is a default exception handler. It will do, by default it will handle that exception. If none of the methods are handling the exception, so then by default this default exception handler only, it will handle that exception. Okay, so while handling that exception, what it will do, it will print the exception message. Okay, what is that exception type, which exception it is, and what is the exception message, and along with that it will also print the stack trace of this exception. Okay, so if I'll execute now, okay, if you'll see here what it is doing, it is telling like which exception it is. It is nothing but file not found exception. Okay, and what is the exception message? No such file or directory. Okay, so this is the, so along with this exception name and exception message, it will also print the stack trace of this exception. So stack trace means in which are all this line this exception object got delegated, right? So that means if you'll see here, the exception occur at what time first, in which line first, line number 18 itself or not? Here itself you are performing the file operation, so that is why it in the line number 18 it got occurred. Then you are delegating that exception. Now it will comes to this line number 12. Okay, now again it is also not handling that exception, then again it is coming to this line number 7. So that means it will print the stack trace of this exception, or this exception is delegated in from which line to which line, that stack trace itself it will print also. Okay, so that is nothing but, what is nothing but throws keyword. So what do you mean by throws keyword? If you are not interested to handle the exception, so then you can delegate that exception object to your color method. Okay, by using the throws keyword. So you can throw the respective exception class object to the color method. If none of the methods are handling the exception by writing the try and catch block, so at the end it will goes to the JVM, and inside the JVM the default exception handler only, it will print that exception name and exception message, and along with that the stack trace of this exception. So all this information it will be printed by the default exception handler inside the JVM itself. Okay, so this is nothing but throws keyword.
What do you mean by throws keyword and what is the purpose of throws keyword? So that you can, if you are not interested to handle the exception, you can delegate that exception object to that color method by using the throws keyword. Okay, so this is nothing but throws keyword. Okay.